Welcome back to Crime Time Inc. We've got a case file today that's been making headlines all over the world, the Giselle Pelicot case out of France.
Yeah, it's certainly been attracting a lot of attention internationally.
We're going to try to unpack this one together.
I think one of the things that makes this case so disturbing is that it's not just a single crime, it really kind of reveals a much larger network of horrifying events and and unsettling realities, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and the scale of it is really almost hard to wrap your head around. We're talking Dominique Pelicot, Giselle's husband, married for 50 years, convicted of drugging her and raping her repeatedly for over a decade, often with other men.
Right.
He was sentenced to 20 years.
Right.
But that's really just the beginning here.
Yeah, it's really important to understand that this story goes so much further than just Dominique Pelicot himself. 51 other men were actually convicted alongside him. Their sentences added up to over 400 years, and at least 11 more suspects are still out there.
Wow. I mean, those numbers are just staggering. But I think what's really hit home for a lot of people is Giselle's response to all of this. She chose to waive her anonymity. She basically made this trial public, which forced this whole thing into the spotlight, and I think has really started a national conversation in France about rape and consent and the legal system itself.
That's a huge point. I mean, by going public like this, Giselle Pelicot made a very, very conscious decision to bring all of these horrific acts into the light. I mean, this could have stayed hidden, but she refused to let that happen.
And I think just the details that have come out are difficult to process. You've got Dominique Pelicot, 72 years old, outwardly seemed like your average guy, part of the community, but he was systematically drugging his wife, slipping sedatives into her food, her drinks, so that he could assault her. And then during the trial, we heard about 20,000 indecent images and videos. He was documenting the abuse. And
that's really where we start to see how calculated his actions actually were. This wasn't just opportunistic. This was planned and deliberate and kind of methodical. And what's maybe even more concerning is you have this whole range of men that were involved, 27 to 84, from all walks of life. Journalists, tradesmen, some of these guys seem to have stable families.
I mean, it really makes you wonder how well we can actually know the people around us. Like, who would suspect this kind of darkness beneath the surface of what appears to be a very normal life?
Right. And I think that's what makes this whole case so unsettling. It really challenges our assumptions about what evil looks like. We tend to think of monsters as these easily identifiable figures, but this case really throws all that out the window.
So let's break this down a little bit, starting with Dominique Pelicot himself. What can we get from these sources about his personality, his possible motivations? I mean, how does someone become capable of these kinds of acts?
Well, one of the things that jumps out is this stark contrast between his outward persona and the depravity of his crimes. His neighbors describe him as quiet, unassuming, the kind of guy that blends into the background. But then underneath all of that, he's orchestrating this elaborate, abusive scheme.
Did anything in the sources touch on his psychological state? Did he express any remorse for what he did or offer any kind of explanation for his behavior?
Well, during the trial, he did actually confess to all of the charges. And he acknowledged the massive harm he had caused. He even referred to his actions as a tsunami. However, he disputed the prosecution's portrayal of him as like the conductor of the abuse.
So he's taking some level of responsibility. But also trying to kind of minimize his role in it all. What could the strategy there be?
Right. And it really is the key question, isn't it? I mean, is this genuine remorse combined with this warped perception of his own actions? Or is this a calculated attempt to kind of manipulate the narrative and minimize how responsible he really is? It's also worth noting that his defense team pointed to a history of childhood trauma. They claim that. He witnessed his father raping his mother and that he was even forced to participate in a gang rape himself.
Wow.
Their argument is that these experiences created cracks in his personality.
That brings up such a difficult question. I mean, should we consider childhood trauma as a mitigating factor in a case like this?
It's such a complex issue with no easy answers, really. I mean, the impact of trauma is obviously crucial. It can't be used to excuse criminal behavior. But it does add this other layer of complexity to understanding what his motivations might have been.
Absolutely. Now let's shift focus a little bit to Giselle. I mean, her strength in coming forward it's really remarkable to endure a decade of this and then have the courage to face it all in such a public trial is incredibly brave.
And what really struck me about her testimony was how composed she remained. and her dignity. Even when recounting the most harrowing details, she was steadfast. It was like she refused to let the abuse break her.
There's a quote from her during the trial that I think really resonated with a lot of people. She said, "Shame must change sides." It almost became this rallying cry for her supporters.
Yeah, and it really speaks to her refusal to be defined by shame.
Yeah.
You know, instead she's demanding accountability and justice.
It's incredibly inspiring to see someone take such a firm stance in a situation like this. It really highlights how powerful a single voice can be in sparking change.
Right. And her decision to make the trial public really kind of ignited a movement. There were protests and intense media attention and these widespread discussions all across France about consent and rape laws and how victims are treated. It was.
And you can't ignore the impact this must have had on her children as well. I mean, to have this truth come out about their father, I can't imagine what they must be going through.
Yeah, it was particularly heartbreaking to hear the testimony of Pelicot's daughter, Caroline. She revealed that she believed she may have been a victim of his abuse as well. Police found images of her on his computer, some showing her in her underwear and others in clothing that she didn't recognize.
That's just devastating. And was he charged with anything related to his daughter?
Unfortunately, there wasn't enough evidence to press charges, which really just means that there's this whole other layer of potential victims and trauma that may never see justice.
Yeah. This case just seems to keep getting darker and darker. I think it really underscores how abuse can stay hidden for so long. You know, it thrives in secrecy, behind closed doors. Victims silenced by fear or shame or manipulation.
Absolutely. And this is where we need to start looking at the larger context, I think. This case brings up these serious questions about how the French legal system handles rape cases, particularly when it comes to consent and the use of drugs.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. The French definition of rape is actually different from a lot of other European countries. Could you maybe elaborate on that for our listener a little bit?
Sure. So unlike a lot of other countries, France's rape law doesn't actually explicitly require proof of a lack of consent. Instead, prosecutors have to prove violence, coercion, threat, or surprise.
So how did that apply to the Pelicot case?
Well, Pelicot's defense team actually tried to use this legal framework to their advantage. They argued that because Giselle was unconscious, the men couldn't have known, that she wasn't consenting.
That's outrageous. I mean, how can someone possibly consent when they're unconscious?
And that was exactly the argument that Giselle's supporters and a lot of legal experts made. They said that drugging someone inherently means they can't consent, and that the law really needs to be updated to reflect that.
Did the trial have any impact on those laws?
So far, there haven't been any immediate changes to the legislation, but it has definitely ignited a big national conversation about the issue. The case has become a rallying point for activists and organizations that are pushing for legal reform. They want to see a more explicit recognition of consent in the law and tougher penalties for drugging and sexual assault cases.
So it sounds like this trial really was a kind of a turning point, a moment of reckoning for France.
Yeah, I think so. It's forced this re-examination of rape culture and how prevalent coercive control is in relationships and all the systemic failures that allow abusers to continue to operate unchecked.
You mentioned coercive control, and I have to admit that's not a term I'm totally familiar with. Can you maybe explain that a little bit more for our listener?
Of course. So coercive control is basically a pattern of behavior that aims to dominate and control a partner. It goes beyond, isolated incidents of violence. It's about creating this whole environment of fear and dependence and isolation.
And how does that concept relate to what Dominique Pelicot was doing?
Well, his behavior is like the textbook definition of coercive control. The drugging and the control over every aspect of Giselle's life. It all points to this deliberate strategy to strip her of any agency and autonomy.
We also heard about him incurring significant debts in her name.
Right. And financial abuse is a really common tactic in coercive control. By controlling her finances, he could further isolate her and make it that much harder for her to leave.
It's so insidious, this gradual erosion of someone's sense of self and their ability to escape. It's no wonder Giselle didn't realize what was happening for so long.
Right, and that's one of the most dangerous things about coercive control. It can be so hard for victims to even recognize the abuse, let alone escape it. They often end up blaming themselves or feeling trapped or fearful of the consequences of speaking out.
And we can't forget the long-term psychological impact on Giselle and her children.
Absolutely. The trauma of this kind of abuse can have lifelong consequences. It can manifest as anxiety or depression or PTSD or,
Yeah.
difficulty trusting others. There are so many challenges. And for Caroline, having to grapple with the fact that she may have been a victim too, it's just an unimaginable burden.
There is just so much to unpack here, and this is really just the beginning of our exploration of this.
It really makes you think about all the ripple effects this has.
Exactly. What about those 11 suspects that are still out there? Will they ever face justice?
That's the big question, isn't it? Kind of hanging over everything.
Yeah.
And you have to think about the message this sends to other potential victims. I mean, does this give them the courage to come forward? Or does it just reinforce that fear that they won't be believed, that the system is stacked against them?
These are such important questions. I mean, this case has really exposed some serious flaws, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, it's forced this national conversation in France about some very uncomfortable truths about power and consent and how women are treated. It's challenged some very ingrained attitudes and assumptions.
So a real wake-up call for the country.
You could definitely say that. And you see this conversation happening everywhere, in the media, in political debates, even just like everyday conversations. There's this sense that things can't go back to the way they were.
Do the sources give us any specific examples of that shift?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just look at the way the media covered the trial. They gave a level of detail and attention to Giselle's testimony that I think would have been unthinkable just a few years ago.
So there's a greater sensitivity now towards victims, less of that focus on sensationalizing the crimes themselves.
Exactly. And there's also this real push for legal reform. There's a significant movement to actually update France's rape laws to include a much clearer definition of consent, and to make drugging someone in this context recognized as a form of assault that completely negates consent.
Are there any indications that these calls for change are being heard?
It's early, but there are some positive signs. Even before the verdicts were announced, the French government announced new measures to support victims of drugging. This includes things like easier access to testing kits and support services.
Okay, that's definitely a step in the right direction. But what about the larger cultural shifts? I mean, is there any evidence that people are actually changing the way they think and talk about these issues?
That's always harder to measure, but look at the public discourse. I mean, there's been this huge surge in social media conversations about consent and toxic masculinity and the need to believe victims. It's a start.
So it sounds like alongside the legal and political battles, there's this kind of a grassroots awakening happening as well.
Yeah, and I think this case has really become this touchstone for a whole generation of activists and just everyday citizens that are demanding change. They're challenging the status quo and demanding that women's voices be heard and that their experiences be taken seriously.
That's a bit of a glimmer of hope amidst all the darkness. But there's also a sense of frustration in these sources, isn't there? This feeling that this is just the tip of the iceberg, that there's still so much more work to do.
Absolutely. I mean, we can't forget about all those other victims out there whose stories haven't been told, whose abusers haven't been held accountable. And even with these convictions, a lot of people feel like the sentences given to a lot of these men were just too lenient.
So there's this sense that true justice hasn't really been served.
I think a lot of people feel that way, yeah. This case really exposed those deep inequalities and biases that still exist within the justice system.
Speaking of biases, I can't help but notice this lack of focus on Dominique's motivations. Why did he do this? What was going on in his head?
Yeah, it's the question that really lingers throughout this whole case. We get these glimpses into his past, the trauma he claims to have endured, but it doesn't really offer a complete explanation.
Yeah.
Maybe there isn't, like a single satisfying answer.
It's a reminder that human behavior can be, especially in cases of extreme cruelty, just incredibly complex and difficult to really grasp. We may never fully understand what drove Dominique to do what he did.
And that's unsettling, isn't it, to be confronted with this level of evil and not have a neat explanation for it?
It definitely challenges our desire for order and understanding in the world. But maybe that discomfort, that unsettling feeling is actually a necessary step towards meaningful change. You know it. It forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths that we might otherwise prefer to ignore.
I think you're right. And this case is just this stark reminder that dismantling rape culture and achieving true equality it's a long and difficult journey, and it requires us to be constantly vigilant and to challenge our own assumptions and to never lose sight of the human stories at the heart of it all.
Powerful words. Which leads us to the question that lingers in the aftermath of all this.
Yeah.
What happens next?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Will this momentum for change actually be sustained? Will those legal reforms actually be enacted? Will the victims, both those directly involved and the countless others watching this unfold, will they find the support and the justice they deserve?
We can't answer those questions definitively today, but what we can say is that the Giselle Pelicot case has irrevocably changed the landscape. It sparked this national conversation. It's forced a reckoning with some very uncomfortable truths and
empowered this whole new generation of activists.
And Giselle herself, with her incredible courage and her dignity, has become this symbol of hope and resilience.
Yeah.
She's shown the world that even in the darkest circumstances, one voice can make a difference, can spark a movement, can demand a better future.
Absolutely. And her closing statement at the trial really captured that spirit. I read it in one of the articles you shared.
Yeah, it was powerful. She said, "I respect the court and I respect the decisions, but when I started, I wanted to ensure the society could see what was happening. And I don't regret that." Yeah. It's this reminder that even in the face of unimaginable trauma, there's still room for strength, for hope, for this belief in the power of speaking truth to power.
And that truth, as uncomfortable as it might be, has the potential to ignite real and lasting change.
This case has been such a roller coaster of emotions, this journey into some of the darkest aspects of human behavior. But it's also been such a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit and the courage to shine a light into those dark places.
Yeah.
Unwavering belief in a better world.
So now we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and examine a specific element of this case that really stood out to me.
I'm really interested to hear what you're thinking. What is it specifically?
Well, it's the way the media talked about the men, involved in the abuse. They kept using this phrase, Mr. Everyman, to describe them. And
it is a jarring description, for sure. It makes it all the more unsettling to think that these weren't, shadowy figures lurking on the fringes of society. These were seemingly ordinary guys, jobs, families, social circles, people you might pass on the street every day.
Yeah, and it shatters that myth that abusers are easily identifiable, that they wear their evil on their sleeve. It forces us to confront the fact that evil can hide behind this mask of normalcy.
And that's a terrifying thought. I mean, it makes you question everyone, doesn't it? Like, how can you ever truly know anyone?
Yeah, it's deeply unsettling. But I think that discomfort, that sense of unease, can also be a catalyst for change, It forces us to be more vigilant, to pay closer attention to the dynamics of power and control in our own relationships and communities.
So instead of retreating into fear, we should use this case as a wake-up call.
Exactly. We can't afford to be naive about the prevalence of abuse. We need to have those difficult conversations about consent and recognizing the red flags and challenging toxic masculinity.
And we need to be willing to challenge those around us when we see those red flags, to speak up and to intervene and create a culture where abuse is simply not tolerated.
Absolutely. I mean, this case really showed that silence only protects the abusers. And it's the responsibility of society as a whole to break that silence, to create a safe space for victims to come forward and make sure that abusers are held accountable for their actions.
We've talked a lot about the impact of this case in France, but it's clear that this is resonating on a global level. What parallels do you see with other countries and cultures?
Yeah, this case really goes beyond national borders. It speaks to some universal truth about abuse. Its insidious nature, the challenges of holding abusers accountable, and the power of one voice to spark a movement for change.
It's a reminder that while the specifics of the laws and cultural context may differ, the underlying dynamics of abuse are, sadly, universal.
And they often play out in the shadows, hidden behind closed doors, protected by silence and shame.
Which is why Giselle Pelicot's decision to waive her anonymity was so powerful. I mean it. It shattered the silence. It exposed those hidden dynamics, and it forced the world to pay attention.
Her bravery has been an inspiration to so many. She's shown that speaking out, even when it's incredibly painful, can be a catalyst for change and can empower others to come forward, demand justice, and break the cycle of abuse.
It's a powerful reminder that while the pursuit of justice may be slow, the fight for equality may be long and arduous. It's a fight worth having.
It is. It demands our attention and our courage and our unwavering commitment to creating a world where abuse is not tolerated, where victims are supported and perpetrators are held accountable.
So well said. This whole deep dive into the Giselle Pelicot case has been incredibly informative and thought-provoking, but it's also left me feeling really troubled, to be honest.
Yeah, it's a case that stays with you. But I do think amidst all of the darkness, there's also this glimmer of hope. We're seeing this global movement demanding change, challenging the status quo, fighting for a better future.
And Giselle Pelicot really stands as this powerful symbol of that movement. Her courage is a beacon of light, reminding us that even in the face of unimaginable trauma, the human spirit can endure and resist and demand a brighter tomorrow.
It's a future we must all strive to create.
Thank you so much for guiding us through this complex and disturbing case. Your insights have been invaluable.
It's been a privilege to share this conversation with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for taking this deep dive with us. I know Tom has a particular interest in this case, so it will be interesting to hear his thoughts on this case.